The Vrynn Empire operated on a principle that had served them well for 3,000 years. Proper documentation prevents all problems, and technology separates civilization from chaos. So when they arrested Dalton Cress for establishing an unauthorized habitation on Canandor 9, a moon they'd claimed but never bothered to use, they followed protocol with the kind of thoroughness that would make a tax auditor weep with joy. They took his ship's navigation core first, then the backup. They confiscated his comm array, his fabricator, his matter printer, and the handheld multi-tool he'd owned since his first cargo run. They even took his fire starter, which seemed excessive until the magistrate explained that it contained a micro-battery and therefore qualified as restricted technology under subsection 47 of the Exile provisions. Dalton had pointed out that humans had been making fire for roughly 200,000 years before inventing batteries, but the Vrynn didn't deal in hypotheticals. They dealt in regulations. The sentence was exile to Canandor 9 itself, the very moon he'd attempted to settle. The irony appeared lost on them. They delivered him to the surface with the clothes on his back, 3 days of ration bars, and a stern warning that attempting to leave the atmosphere would trigger automated defense systems. Then they departed, their ship's engines leaving scorch marks on the grass that would fade in a week. Dalton stood in the clearing and watched them go. Around him the forest of Canandor 9 whispered in a wind that smelled of pine and something faintly citrus. The Vrynn had classified this moon as insufficient for development, too far from trade routes, too poor in rare minerals, too ordinary. They were right on all counts, which was precisely why Dalton had chosen it. He'd wanted somewhere quiet to run a small homestead between cargo jobs. Now he'd gotten his wish, minus everything that made homesteading convenient. He didn't panic. Panic was a waste of calories. The first week existed in a state of careful observation that would have bored anyone watching. Dalton walked the forest, noting which direction water flowed, always downhill from the ridge to the east, and which trees had shallow root systems that caught his feet. He watched what the local animals ate and what they avoided. The small ones with the tufted ears devoured purple berries from low bushes, but wouldn't touch the similar-looking red ones on the vines. That told him something, though he wasn't ready to test which variety was toxic. He found a cave on the third day, shallow but dry, with a ceiling high enough to stand in and an opening that faced south, away from the prevailing winds. The floor was covered in leaves and small animal droppings, which meant previous occupants but no current residents. He cleared it out, using his hands and a flat piece of bark he found outside. The work took hours and left his palms raw, but the cave became his first piece of infrastructure. At night, he watched the stars and tried to remember everything he'd half-learned about friction fires and stone tools from educational programs he'd never paid much attention to. Humans had done this before, obviously. They'd done it on Earth without any prior knowledge, just figured it out through trial and error spanning generations. Dalton had one significant advantage: he knew it was possible. On the fourth day, he began collecting straight branches, not because he had a specific plan but because they seemed like they might be useful. He laid them near the cave entrance, sorting them by rough size. The act of organizing felt good, like imposing a small piece of order on a situation that could easily slip into chaos. By the end of the first week, Dalton had identified a reliable water source, established a shelter, and hadn't eaten anything poisonous. He'd also discovered that sleeping on cave floors made everything hurt. The ration bars were gone. From here on he was living on local resources, or not living at all. Building the shelter took 11 days of failures that would have made excellent comedy footage if anyone had been filming. Dalton started with an ambitious design involving woven branches and a sloped roof, which collapsed on the second night when rain soaked the bindings he'd made from grass. The grass dissolved. The structure fell on him while he slept, which was startling but not actually dangerous unless you counted the blow to his pride. He tried again with different materials. The vines he'd noticed earlier, the ones the tufted ear animals used for nests, turned out to be remarkably strong when dried. He wove them between vertical posts he'd driven into the ground using rocks as hammers, creating walls that flexed but held. The roof remained a problem until he discovered that certain broad leaves, layered like shingles and held down with mud, created a surprisingly waterproof barrier. The mud itself became a revelation. Mixed with the right amount of grass for binding, it dried into something approaching adobe. Dalton daubed it into the gaps between branches, creating walls that blocked wind and retained heat. The whole structure looked like something from a historical drama about early humans, which was appropriate because that's essentially what he'd become. The Vrynn would have consulted committees. They would have filed environmental impact assessments and structural integrity reports. They would have debated proper building codes for months before placing the first support beam. Dalton just built, failed, adjusted, and built again. By the time the shelter was complete, he'd learned more about the properties of local plants than any database could have told him. Fire came next, and fire was humbling. Dalton knew the theory: friction creates heat, heat ignites tinder, tinder lights kindling, but theory and practice maintained a vast and frustrating distance. His first attempts at a bow drill produced smoke and blisters, but no flame. The wood was wrong, or the pressure was wrong, or his technique was wrong, or possibly all three simultaneously. He tried for 2 days straight, stopping only to drink water and eat the small yellow fruits he'd identified as safe, through careful observation of animal behavior. The bough snapped. He made another bough. On the morning of the 3rd day, smoke became an ember, and the ember touched dry fungus he'd gathered from dead trees, and the fungus bloomed into flame like a tiny orange miracle. Dalton sat back and watched his first fire burn, feeding it carefully with twigs and then larger branches. The achievement was absurd and profound in equal measure. He'd created fire. Humans had been doing this for millennia, but right now, in this moment, he was the only person on this entire moon who could make heat appear from nothing but wood and determination. The shelter became weatherproof. He named it Nothing because naming a shelter seemed unnecessary when you were the only one who knew it existed. Hunting without weapons required a shift in thinking that ran counter to every modern instinct. Dalton couldn't chase down prey. The local animals were faster and knew the terrain better. He couldn't shoot them from a distance. He had no projectile weapons, and his attempts to create a functional bow for hunting proved that archery was significantly harder than historical dramas suggested. Instead, he built traps. Deadfalls, specifically, using carefully balanced stones triggered by prey weight. The first dozen failed because the triggers were too sensitive or not sensitive enough, or because he'd placed them in locations that animals had no reason to visit. But animals followed patterns, and patterns could be learned. They used the same trails through the underbrush. They visited the stream at predictable times. They could be anticipated. The first successful trap yielded something that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a ferret, which tasted like neither but provided protein and fat, and a small pelt that Dalton scraped clean and dried. He felt briefly guilty about the killing, then pragmatic, then hungry enough that the guilt faded into the background static of survival. Fish proved easier once he figured them out. The stream contained eel-like creatures that moved in schools and weren't particularly intelligent. Dalton wove a fish weir from flexible saplings, creating a funnel trap that let fish swim in but confused them on the way out. He checked it each morning, and usually found something, which he cleaned and smoked over his fire on a rack made from green wood that wouldn't burn. The smoking process was another skill acquired through patient failure. Too much smoke made the meat bitter. Too little left it spoiling by the next day. The right amount, combined with the right distance from the fire and the right type of wood, created preserved food that would last weeks. Dalton began to accumulate surplus, which changed the entire calculus of his days. Surplus meant he could spend time on projects that weren't directly related to the next meal. Persistence, the narrator might observe, is humanity's most underestimated quality. Not strength, not intelligence, not adaptability, though humans had those too, but the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that today's failure meant tomorrow's impossibility. The clay appeared on a morning when Dalton was checking his fish weir. The stream had cut through a bend, exposing a bank of dense grey material that stuck to his fingers when he touched it. He recognized it immediately because humans had been working with clay since before recorded history. Clay meant containers. Containers meant storage. Storage meant civilization. His first pottery attempts looked like something a child might make, and then immediately abandon. He shaped crude bowls and left them in the sun to dry, but they crumbled when he tried to fire them in his campfire. The heat was wrong, or the clay needed something added to it, or he was doing everything wrong simultaneously. Probably that last one. He experimented. Clay mixed with sand didn't crack as readily when drying. Clay fired slowly, with gradually increasing temperature, became harder than clay subjected to immediate high heat. Clay vessels needed to cool slowly, or they developed fracture lines that made them useless. Each variable required testing, and each test took a day or more. The 19th attempt produced a bowl that survived firing, held water, and didn't leak. Dalton stared at it for a full minute. This curved piece of hardened earth that he'd created through nothing but attention and repeated failure. The Vrynn archives probably contained detailed specifications for pottery that would have made this instantaneous. Those archives were 10,000 light-years away and completely useless. This bowl, crude and slightly lopsided, was here and functional and his. He made more bowls, then larger vessels for water storage. With containers, his range expanded. He could travel further from the stream to explore, carrying water with him. He could store foraged foods separately instead of eating everything immediately. The pottery multiplied his capability in ways that weren't dramatic, but were absolutely fundamental. With water containers enabling longer exploration, Dalton ranged further from his shelter and discovered an outcropping of dark stone that fractured in useful ways. He'd seen enough historical demonstrations to recognize flint, or at least something close enough for practical purposes. Stone that broke into sharp edges. Stone that could become tools. Knapping was an art that made pottery look simple. Dalton struck stones together and produced fragments that went in every direction except useful ones. He cut his fingers repeatedly. He shattered promising pieces with poorly aimed blows. He learned that striking angle mattered, that force mattered, that the internal structure of the stone determined whether it would fracture predictably or explode into gravel. His first successful hand axe was ugly and asymmetrical, but had an edge sharp enough to cut flesh when he tested it carefully on his thumb. From there, scrapers for processing hides, a proper axe head that he hafted to a wooden handle using dried vine lashings and pine resin as adhesive. The axe changed everything. Trees that would have taken hours to process with broken rocks now fell in minutes. He could create planks, build better structures, harvest firewood efficiently. Each tool enabled the creation of better tools. The axe let him build a more sophisticated bow drill, which he used to create a primitive lathe that could turn wooden components into more uniform shapes. A sharp scraper meant better processed hides, which meant leather strips for bindings that wouldn't rot like vine. Better bindings meant more durable tools. The progression was exponential, capability breeding capability, all from materials the Vrynn had classified as primitive matter, insufficient for civilization. The irony would have been delicious if Dalton had anyone to share it with. The trees began changing in ways that were subtle until they weren't. The broad leaves shifted from deep green to something with yellow undertones. The tufted ear animals grew thicker coats. The morning air carried a sharper edge. Dalton didn't know Canandor 9's seasonal cycle. The Vrynn hadn't bothered to document it in detail, but he recognized the signs of transition. Something was coming. Probably cold. He intensified his preparations with the methodical attention of someone who understood that winter, or whatever this moon's equivalent might be, didn't care about good intentions. He smoked more meat. He gathered and stored edible roots and nuts. He improved his shelter's insulation, packing the walls with a mixture of mud and dried moss that created surprising thermal mass. He stockpiled firewood using his stone axe, cutting and stacking until he had enough to burn continuously for months. The work was repetitive, unglamorous, and completely necessary. Survival wasn't one dramatic moment of triumph. It was thousands of small preparations, the kind of tedious foresight that looked boring right up until it became the difference between living and freezing to death. When the cold arrived, Dalton was ready. His shelter held heat. His food stores lasted. He spent the long dark periods improving his tools, experimenting with new designs, thinking about metallurgy. Because he'd noticed something during his explorations, certain areas near the stream had reddish soil that felt heavier than normal dirt. Pog iron possibly, which meant metal was theoretically achievable if he could figure out smelting. 6 months into his exile, a Vrynn observation drone passed overhead on a routine monitoring sweep of the quarantine zone. Its sensors scanned for technology signatures, electromagnetic emissions, power sources, refined metals, anything that would indicate unauthorized development or escape attempts. It detected nothing. The automated systems logged the result: human subject presumed deceased. Natural conclusion of unauthorized settlement. Recommend reclassification of Canandor 9 to uncontested territory. The drone continued its patrol pattern, utterly confident in its assessment. Below, Dalton worked on improving his kiln design, trying to achieve higher temperatures for better pottery. He'd built the kiln from clay bricks he'd made himself, with a chimney that created better draft and a firing chamber that could be sealed. The current version worked but wasn't efficient. He thought he could do better with a different internal structure. He didn't notice the drone. He was focused on kiln architecture. The irony was exquisite. The Empire's sensors were looking for all the wrong things, mistaking absence of their technology for absence of life. They couldn't recognize civilization that didn't announce itself electronically. To their instruments, Dalton had vanished. In reality, he'd simply stepped outside their definitional framework. Spring arrived, though Dalton still didn't know to call it that. The trees budded. Animals emerged from wherever they'd spent the cold months. The stream ran higher with melt from the ridge, and Dalton, warm and fed and very much alive, began thinking about agriculture. He'd been eating wild plants for months now, learning which were nutritious and which were merely edible. Some plants produced more than others. Some had larger seeds or sweeter fruits. In his previous life, Dalton would have ordered seeds from a catalogue, consulted growing guides, used soil sensors, and automated watering systems. Now he had observation, experimentation, and time. He created small garden plots near his shelter, clearing the ground and working in fish remains as fertilizer. He planted seeds from the most productive wild specimens he'd found, the yellow fruits, certain protein-rich seeds, a tuber that roasted well. He watched what grew and what didn't. He noticed which plants seemed to thrive when placed together and which ones competed poorly. It was agriculture in its most fundamental form, encouraging useful plants, discouraging competitors, working with the ecosystem rather than trying to dominate it. The Vrynn probably had genetic optimization databases and nutrient synthesis protocols that could produce perfect crops in controlled environments. Dalton's garden, grown through patient observation and seasonal iteration, produced exactly what he needed, with zero resource imports and no supply chain complications. The first harvest was small but significant. He'd created controlled abundance. He was no longer entirely dependent on hunting and foraging. The garden would produce reliably, year after year, if he maintained it properly. That if contained generations of agricultural knowledge, but Dalton was learning. The settlement expanded organically, without planning or permits or anyone's permission. Dalton built a second structure for storage, using techniques he'd refined over months of practice. The walls were straight, the roof was weatherproof, and the whole thing took a quarter of the time his first shelter had required. Competence accumulated like interest. He built a workshop next, specifically designed for his kiln and forge. Better ventilation, stone flooring that wouldn't catch fire, clay walls that could withstand heat. The forge itself was an ambitious project that consumed weeks of experimentation. He'd confirmed that the reddish soil contained iron, and he'd managed to extract small amounts of workable metal through a process of heating, hammering, reheating, and more hammering. The metallurgy was primitive by any modern standard, but it was metallurgy. He created a crude knife with an edge that actually held better than stone, but requiring constant maintenance. He made chisels, a proper saw, metal fittings for his tools. Each piece expanded his capability. Water management came next. Dalton built a system of clay pipes and wooden channels that brought stream water directly to his garden and living area. The engineering was basic: gravity feed, no pumps, no pressure regulation, but it worked. He no longer spent an hour each day hauling water. That hour could be invested in other improvements. The settlement began to look intentional. Multiple buildings arranged in logical proximity. Cleared paths between structures. The garden laid out in organized rows. Storage areas for tools, for food, for raw materials. An outsider, if one had appeared, would have recognized it immediately as infrastructure. The foundation of civilization. Dalton had created all of this without permits, without plans, without anyone's permission or assistance. Just wood and stone, and clay and time, and the very human refusal to accept limitations as permanent. 18 months after his exile, a Vrynn administrative ship entered Canandor 9's orbit for routine reclassification surveys. The Empire periodically reviewed unclaimed territories to update their databases and ensure no unauthorized activity had developed. The process was bureaucratic and thorough, and generally boring. The scanning officer noticed geometric patterns in the forest canopy. Clearings that were too regular, structures that showed right angles. Organized agriculture visible from orbit. She flagged the sector for closer investigation, confused because the drone sweep 6 months ago had reported no activity. The landing party consisted of the ship's commander, 2 documentation specialists, and a security officer who seemed disappointed that this wasn't a combat situation. They descended to find Dalton's settlement, multiple buildings of wood and clay construction, irrigated garden plots showing active cultivation, a functional forge with a stone chimney, stored surplus food, and Dalton himself calmly tending his crops. The Vrynn commander stared. His documentation specialists began taking frantic notes. The security officer examined the settlement for hidden technology, finding none. "You are the human Dalton Cress," the commander said finally. "You were exiled here 18 months ago." "I'm aware," Dalton replied, continuing to weed around his vegetable plants. "You were stripped of all technology. You arrived with no tools, no resources, no infrastructure support." "Also aware. Then where did all this come from?" The commander gestured at the settlement. "Where are the purchase records? The supply shipments? The contractor documentation?" Dalton straightened up, wiping dirt from his hands. "I built it, from wood and stone and clay, materials that were already here." The documentation specialists consulted their tablets furiously. One of them looked up, confused. "These materials are classified as raw planetary matter, pre-industrial category. One does not build society from such resources. One processes them into proper materials first, using appropriate technology. Or, Dalton suggested, one just uses them directly and skips the processing. That's not how civilization works. Isn't it, though? Dalton walked them through the settlement, showing them the pottery kiln, the forge, the water management system, the preserved food stores. He explained the techniques he'd developed for each process. The Vrynn took extensive documentation, clearly filing this as some kind of anomaly requiring further study. The commander eventually spoke. "This settlement is unauthorized. Canandor 9 has been reclassified from uninhabitable to under-human settlement, which requires entirely different paperwork. You'll need to submit proper applications, environmental assessments, and infrastructure plans." "I'll get right on that," Dalton said, in a tone that suggested he absolutely would not. Before leaving, the Vrynn offered to relocate Dalton to a proper colony with registered infrastructure and legal status. He declined. They found this incomprehensible. Why would anyone choose to remain on a primitive world when civilization was available elsewhere? Dalton gestured at his settlement, the garden ready for harvest, the workshop full of projects in various stages of completion, the forge, where he'd been experimenting with different iron processing techniques. "This is civilization," he said, "just not your kind." The Vrynn couldn't process that statement. To them, civilization meant technology, documentation, regulated systems. Buildings made from wood and stone were historical curiosities, not functional infrastructure. Agriculture without genetic optimization was inefficient. Tools made from raw materials were primitive by definition. They departed, still confused, updating their files to note that human settlement patterns defied standard classification protocols. The security officer filed a report recommending monitoring for potential technology smuggling, unable to accept that all of this had been built from scratch. One of the documentation specialists suggested establishing an observation post to study human developmental patterns in low-technology environments. Dalton watched their ship disappear into the sky, the engines leaving the same kind of scorch marks they'd left 18 months ago. Then he returned to his forge. He'd been thinking about the bellows design, how to get better airflow for higher temperatures. If he could achieve sustained higher heat, the iron quality would improve significantly. The Vrynn Empire, with all its technology and documentation, and 3,000 years of regulated development, had meant to exile Dalton Cress to irrelevance. They'd removed him from civilization by removing his tools, confident that without technology he would become nothing. A man without infrastructure was barely a man at all, by their reckoning. Instead, they'd given him exactly what he needed: time, space, and a problem to solve. The settlement on Canandor 9 continued to grow. Imperial archives now listed it as Cultural Anomaly Site, 1547, complete with observation protocols and non-interference guidelines. Somewhere in those vast databases, buried in a subsection about human behavioral patterns, a note indicated that attempting to suppress human civilization by removing technology might be fundamentally flawed. The note suggested that humans appeared to consider technology optional rather than definitional, which contradicted basic imperial assumptions about what constituted society. The note had been flagged for further study. A committee would be formed, reports would be filed. The Empire would eventually reach some kind of conclusion about what this all meant, probably in 5 to 7 years after proper deliberation. Dalton, unaware of his new classification status and unconcerned with Imperial deliberations, perfected his bellows design. The forge burned hotter now, hot enough to work the iron more thoroughly and create better edge retention in his tools. He was thinking about metallurgy, about the difference between iron and steel, about whether he could achieve the carbon content necessary for harder metal. He had time, he had materials, he had patience and persistence and the accumulated knowledge of a species that had bootstrapped itself from stone tools to starships. The Empire had taken his weapons and expected him to fail. He'd rebuilt society instead, one careful observation at a time, and the truly amusing part was that they still didn't understand what they'd witnessed.